it's Ian Palm speaking. I am the co-president of the M&A Club in Toronto. We've got Melanie Russell as well. She's the other co-president. She's on the line as well. So we'd like to welcome you all to this M&A Club meeting today. And we're excited to have some speakers here that are going to do a bit of a repeat performance and an update on a session that was held last year. And this one is focused on the importance of navigating the ESG landscape in the context of many of our clients and groups we work with within the M&A Club. And we've got some real experts here today. I'm going to introduce, there's four of them, and I'll introduce them in the order that I've got here on my screen. So the first one is Janet Howard. She is a partner at Fasken, Martineau, DuMoulin, and based in Toronto. She's a member of Fasken's global mining and energy groups, and is the co-founder of the firm's hydrogen energy advisory team. Janet's as a transactional practice and provides strategic advice to clients engaged in complex transactions. She's also a board member of KDH Technologies, an Ontario-based company focused on the manufacture of hydrolyzers for the production of green energy. So she not only advises on it, she's walking the walk as well. She's joined by one of her colleagues, Sophie Langlois, who's an associate with Fasken. She has a broad-based corporate and transactional practice with a particular focus on engagements with Indigenous peoples and ESG and sustainability. They are joined by Helle Jorgensen, and Helle, I apologize if I mispronounced your name there. She is CEO of Competent Boards, which offers the global online ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program, which I'm sure she'll get into. And the program trains board members and executives to identify and proactively act upon material ESG, climate, and sustainability risks and opportunities. She's an experienced board facilitator, board member, and serves on the Prince of Wales A4S Global Expert Panel and the World Economic Forum Expert Network for Corporate Governance, Leadership, and Emerging Multinationals. And the fourth panelist is Katie Dunphy. Katie is a senior member of KPMG's Sustainability and Impact Services team. And for the last 15 years, she has helped to build a national ESG client service practice, which is embedded across KPMG's audit, tax, and advisory groups. She's got, and I'll let her get into detail on specifics there. Before I pass it over to Janet, I'd just like to say thank you again, all four of you, for taking the time to put this presentation together, to put together a cross-disciplinary team to present, what I think is a very important topic this day. So Janet, over to you.
Yep, thanks very much, Ian. First off, I just want to thank you, Ian and Melanie, for the invitation to come back and speak on this topic. It's something that we're all very passionate about, and it's always terrific to reconnect with Katie and Helle. They are experts, they're at the forefront, so it's great to hear from them about what they're seeing in this space, just to make sure we're all current, because as I'm sure people can appreciate, it's a popular topic and it's fast moving, and there are some updates that we can share with you. So Ian has handled the introductions, but those are our details, contact information. Please feel free to reach out to any of us afterwards and during the presentation. Lorene has already mentioned that there is a chat feature attached. These meetings have always been terrific. When we can meet in person, they're interactive. To the extent we can preserve that, ask questions. Happy to answer anything anyone might want more detail about. So in terms of our agenda, to speak to what Ian was talking about, we've tried to put together a panel so that people can appreciate the different sectors, different expertise that can be brought to bear to help as you're navigating this space. Fair to say, when this came out, I think a lot of people were trying to wrap their heads around what ESG really means. How is it different from CSR? And there has been a lot written about it, a lot in the newspapers. And now people are really focused not just on what do we have to do, but how are we going to do it. So what we want to talk more to today is on implementation, how we can provide some guidance to help implement the policies and the procedures that people are talking about needing to satisfy their criteria. So what we can speak to as lawyers, we can help identify where the ESG criteria can be found, differences between best practices, legal requirements. Katie is very well positioned to speak to the due diligence that can be brought to bear on some of the transactions, the disclosure, the assurance that can be done. And of course, Helle's there. She can provide some terrific insights in terms of how to facilitate the conversations at the board level to get directors focused on what they really need to be concerned about and how to implement strategies. So on our end first, just to make sure we're on the same page, a quick refresher, ESG, what does this mean? ESG, it's an acronym. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. And really, I found it helpful to think of these as factors. They're non-financial performance indicators. So the focus here is not so much on how much is the company making. It's more how is the company stacking up with respect to its performance along a range of criteria that have more to do with the environment, social issues, governance related concerns. And we were getting a lot of questions from clients. Where are these factors? Where are these performance indicators? Where do I need to look? And unfortunately, they're scattered. They're everywhere, which just makes it hard to identify. It's good and bad. In a way, it provides some ability for a company to be selective in determining which of these criteria matter most for its operations, which ones are more relevant for what they're doing. So World Economic Forum has proposed draft metrics. There's a global reporting initiative, the GRI standards. These are all acronyms people focused on the space may be familiar with. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, has detailed some information that you can work through to identify what's necessary, what's recommended. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and the Climate Disclosure Standard Boards. Those are the places we go to look. An update we can offer, what we're seeing now, there is a transition from what's recommended by these organizations in the materials that they have published to what now is becoming legally required. And there are two places that we're seeing that become impactful. And the first relates to legislation that's being put out. And there are specific examples that we can point to. If you look at what the security regulators are doing, for example, they've got requirements for companies to disclose in their continuous disclosure documentation. What impact does a company's operations have on the environment, on GHG emissions? And increasingly, there's focus put on regulatory bodies across Canada, the TSX, the security commissions, focused on providing uniform requirements to start putting some of these practices into law, into the legal requirements. And the other legislation that's coming out, Sophie can speak to it in her comments, modern slavery legislation is contemplated. And we've seen just this week a new bill introduced to implement the requirements on the Indigenous front. The other place, court. So when companies go to court or when there are judicial decisions made, that's another source for legal requirements. And people may be aware, just recently, Shell was actually ordered by court to reduce the carbon emissions that it's emitting from its operations. What does the E stand for? It's how the company's operations impact the environment. So some of these criteria, just to give it some color, GHG emissions is a big one. So reporting. All of these performance indicators distill down from a legal perspective in terms of what can you report? It's a disclosure exercise. So you look at what the performance indicators are, how they impact your operations, and then it becomes a disclosure exercise. What are the GHG emissions that are currently resulting from this company's operations? What are they now? What are our future targets? And how are we going to get there? Climate change. What is the impact of this company's operations on the climate generally? renewable energy is a big one these days. Is there a way we can power the company's business using renewable sources of energy to reduce those GHG emissions? And the rest, they really speak for themselves. And again, there's no hard and fast rule with respect to which of these performance indicators need to be covered in disclosure. It has more to do with what type of business is being conducted and which ones are most relevant for that particular company. Just a few updates that we can offer on the E front. You'll have seen in the papers and from politicians, Biden, a general drive towards a net zero world. When people talk about net zero, getting carbon emissions down to zero. Biden has put out commitments, the Canadian government and governments around the world, the UK, Europe, Chile, they've got hydrogen strategies, for example, to promote the production of an alternate source of fuel to get people off of oil, to transition the diesel-powered businesses, heavy industry, transportation off of the carbon-emitting sources of power to integrate hydrogen into their operations. And there's a push for standardization of the reporting frameworks and obligations. So what we mean here, again, it's about implementation. The institutional shareholder services organization, the website they have, if you go onto that site, you'll see that they're starting to organize their efforts to use their own climate generated data to encourage institutional shareholders to evaluate a company's performance along these metrics and to vote accordingly. So we see climate change voting policy, shareholder proposals on the climate front that are starting to necessitate and impact change. So again, it's about pressure that's being put on companies to make meaningful change so that they can tick the box quickly with respect to what the institutional shareholders are starting to demand. And I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Sophie, to cover the S. Sophie?
Great, thank you so much, Janet, and good morning to everyone. So to pick up on the S side of things, so the S really relates to issues concerning the rights, well-being, and interests of people and communities at a very high level. Focus here is on relationships that the company has with identified stakeholder groups. So one of the challenges for companies here is it's important to identify who are your stakeholders. So these typically will include your customers, your suppliers, members of local communities that are impacted by the operations of your company, and of course your shareholders. So in Canadian law, and without getting too legalistic here, there is a fiduciary obligation for directors to act in the best interest of a corporation. And in the Canadian context, this is defined with reference to the interest of shareholders, of course. So focus on profit maximization and maximizing shareholder profit. But in Canada, we have the BCE decision, which expanded the potential scope of fiduciary duty to include a group of stakeholders beyond just shareholders. So again, this is including reference to creditors, employees, your suppliers, consumers, and even the environment. The BCE decision was recently codified in Canadian law to amend the CBCA to include these factors, including the long-term interest of the corporation. And this differs from the approach in the United States, where a director's primary concern is to maximize shareholder value. So in Canada, given the BCE decision, identifying these stakeholders and conducting your operations in a manner that protects their interests is very important, especially in the context of implementing ESG policies and procedures. So we've listed some indicators here on the slide with respect to social matters, but some of the questions that you may want to ask as a company is, does your company have a human rights code or policy? If you rely on supplies, especially from higher or medium risk jurisdictions, and what I mean by that is jurisdictions where there are less robust legal protections for employees, for example, does your company have a responsible sourcing policy? or code of conduct for your suppliers? And if so, how is this implemented and monitored? Does your company have a robust diversity policy? And so on. So I'll go down to some of the regulatory updates on the S side of things. In the last year, we've seen significant steps taken in Canada to address modern slavery for businesses that operate globally or that have an international supply chain. So this does impact many companies, including small and medium-sized businesses. Now, when I hear of slavery, I think of a concept that is in the far past and something that we have overcome. And I think we've come a long way to combating slavery. But modern day slavery is still very alive and well today. And its impacts are seen here in Canada, in the clothes that we wear, in the ingredients that we purchase, the coffee beans, and many of the products that we purchase. In a recent study conducted by the International Labour Organization, they estimated that about 25 million people were in forced labor around the world, over 150 million children engaged in child labor, half of those in hazardous working conditions. So certainly an important issue that is catching the attention of companies, regulators, and so on. And this has led to some of the regulatory changes that we've seen in this area over the past year. So in the US, Mexico, and Canada agreement, there was a labor chapter, and in that chapter, there was a particular focus on the prohibition against the importation of goods that are produced in whole or in part by forced or compulsory labor, including child labor. Canada has now implemented those measures through its customs tariffs. And those prohibitions do not only apply to goods that are imported from the US or Mexico, but in fact, globally. So what does this mean for companies? Well, companies now need to start spending a bit more attention on scrutinizing their supply chains. So it's no longer enough to say my supplier from whom I purchase t-shirts in Portugal does not use forced labor. We now need to start going down a few tiers to saying, where are the raw materials being sourced? And are these coming from high-risk jurisdictions with potential for forced or child labor? So do keep an eye on these changes in regulation. We also have the Modern Slavery Act in Canada, which is making its way through the legislative process, so not yet in force, but I think soon to come. So do keep an eye on that. There will be new reporting requirements that come out of that particular act. I've also included here Indigenous rights and engagement. Just given the time constraints, I can't give this topic due justice this morning, but as Janet alluded to, the federal government has adopted Bill C-15, which is the federal government's response to calls to implement UNDRIP, which has the concept of free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous communities. So this is something that will occur over the long term, but do keep an eye on those developments.
Will we just zip through these slides just quickly, Sophie? Maybe you could just speak to why they're included.
Yeah,
the high level.
Yeah, let's do it. So a few headlines I just wanted to show as examples. We've got 83 major brands implicated in a report of forced labor. So, this article included companies like Nike, Samsung, some of our favorite brands being implicated in these issues.
And then this one, explain this one. This one caught the attention of a lot of people in the mining group at Fasken.
Yeah, so if you're in the mining, natural resources sector, I'm sure you would have seen this one. We have Rio Tinto blasted 46,000-year-old Indigenous sites. I think next slide, please.
Yep. Governance.
Yeah, so,
yep.
Right. So very, very tragic, something that can never be returned. It led to the stepping down by the firm's chief executive officer and other senior members and staff. So very tragic and led to very serious implications and consequences for management. All right, so now turning over to G. So the G relates to issues concerning governance of companies. Next slide, please. Thank you so much.
Yep, it's on there. I think we might be a bit delayed, Sophie. Can you see the G?
Okay, yep, I see it.
Perfect.
So consideration may be given to whether the board has sufficient representation of all stakeholder groups, whether additional committees should be added, like an ESG committee, for example, the addition of new officers. So we've seen over the last year a major rise in the appointment of sustainability and ethics officers being created. So these are roles that are here for the long term. So we've included a list here of indicators that could be used to assess company performance from the governance perspective. In terms of regulatory updates on the G side, I would say the last year was really focused on diversity and inclusion on boards and management. So we've seen both ISS and Glass Lewis, who are proxy advisory firms, come out with new voting policies. They're now saying that they will recommend voting against chairs of nominating committees if certain gender diversity thresholds are not met. So do keep an eye on those. We've also seen amendments at the CBCA level. So since January 1st of 2020, if you are a Canadian public company under the CBCA, incorporated under the CBCA, you are now required to report on the representation of various designated groups, including gender, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities. So why is ESG relevant to M&A? Why should members of the M&A club care? I mean, all companies are impacted, but I think with respect to M&A in a transactional perspective, I think there's many reasons that we can come up with. I've included 4 here. The first is corporate values and ESG priorities of a buyer, right? So increasingly companies at the management and board level are setting very strong ESG focused mandates, and they're reassessing the corporate purpose for their organization. This will naturally over time trickle into their overall M&A strategy. They will ask, is this particular acquisition consistent with our corporate purpose and ESG strategies? And as a target, you want to be ready for those types of questions and assessments. I think secondly is the transaction risks, right? So notwithstanding whether ESGs has been incorporated into a company's corporate purpose or mandates, there are risks associated with ESG that are reputational for poor management and oversight of ESG factors. And I think we'll continue to see these factors as being very important during the M&A process. The third is access to financing. Access to financing is increasingly going to be connected and linked to ESG. We have over 100 financial institutions globally that have now adopted the Equator principles, which focus on risk management for assessing environmental and social risks in projects. And the last is anticipation of a future IPO. So if you have any dreams of one day going public, the best way to get ready in terms of ESG is starting to think about these issues early. There are very stringent reporting requirements when a company goes public, and many of those relate to ESG, both voluntary and mandatory. So with that, I'll pass it back on to Janet, and I look forward to further discussion.
Great, thanks very much, Sophie. So Sophie's spoken to the why is it relevant. I thought I would touch on how is it relevant. That's my thinking when you're evaluating an M&A transaction or companies. How is ESG relevant to an M&A transaction? The first that comes to mind, does the company have a stated corporate purpose? So part of the work that's done on the G front is identifying what's the corporate purpose for a company. And you identify the corporate purpose in a way, it helps you identify who your stakeholder groups are. Are you satisfying the needs of your stakeholder group to minimize the impact of institutional shareholder action? That's an important question. If a company hasn't even articulated a corporate purpose, the question becomes, have they properly identified their stakeholder groups? And if they haven't, how can they possibly be taking steps to advance and promote their interests, to protect their interests? The second one that comes to mind, does the company, are the ESG factors integrated into the sourcing and purchasing practice, the supply chain, are there related policies? So to capture some of the S factors Sophie was speaking to, if there's no integration of these factors into sourcing, purchasing, are there liabilities or risks associated with the failure to do so? And if that's the case, how is it affecting value or the price to be paid for a company or its assets? The third thing, have ESG related reps and warranties or indemnities been integrated into any of the contractual provisions that you might be assuming? And just one thing to flag, when lawyers pull out the standard form agreements, it becomes very easy to keep the same standard sets of reps and warranties. And there's often a rep, yes, we're complying with all applicable law. Does the definition of applicable law capture any of these ESG requirements? Does it capture the standards? Does it capture the legal requirements? And just to bring it home, there's a difference in that laundry list of sources where you look to find the ESG related criteria. On the Indigenous community front, there's a difference between imposing an obligation or best practice to seek consent versus to consult. So understanding those distinctions, really drilling down, puts companies and those who are engaged in the due diligence exercise, understanding the implications of saying, yes, we're complying. Well, what does that mean? So just our time is up. I'd like to turn it over to Katie and Helle, and just to lead into the conversations there. The fourth thing, how do these ESG considerations impact the M&A due diligence process? Katie's going to be touching on that. And then have ESG considerations been reflected in the board policies and mandates? So I'm happily turning it over to the two of my panelists.
Thank you so much, Janet, Sophie. That was a really excellent introduction. I'm just going to take a moment here and get this into full screen mode. And just to start off, I mean, I think this on one page starts to try to capture the complexity of what we're talking about here. You know, we've heard from my colleagues this morning about the dynamic group of shareholders and the expanded definition of fiduciary duty and shareholder accountability. And so we have on the left-hand side here a representation of a multitude of different stakeholder groups. We have across the top some of the dynamic issues that companies themselves are dealing with, from having an authentic integration of ESG in their strategies, pressure from the board and other, again, significant stakeholders, creating a narrative that is, again, authentic and insightful. And then you have over on the right-hand side of the image, some of the reflections of what this is really talking about, which is the interaction of business with the natural systems and society. So if we're thinking about that as a binary lens rather than unique, we need to always reflect that the impacts that businesses create are not solely on the environment and on people, that I would say, because of a lot of recent developments about what responsible business practices actually mean in practice, there's a duality there, because whatever impacts a business has on its external environment, those in return have equal or more impacts on the business in terms of its ability to create profits. So moving forward here, we've touched on a number of these in the earlier part of the introduction in terms of the rise of the ESG agenda. What I'd really like to do is perhaps go into one particular area which I tend to spend a lot of my time in, and that's working with investors, so institutional investors, asset managers. Now, there is an expectation that ESG can provide enhanced risk management and impact investment returns. So, you know, right now, about 75% of institutional investors, according to recent KPMG research, indicate that they now consider ESG factors as material to their investment analysis. So again, just reinforcing the rationale in addition to a number of other reasons, people are really starting to take ESG factors much more seriously. And I think this last year in particular has really brought to the forefront a number of vulnerabilities, if you will, that perhaps were less evident prior to the beginning of the pandemic. So for example, what we've seen and where there's going to be increased attention are on topics like health and safety of employees and customers, labor market vulnerability. I also read some recent research about the expanded expectation of the social safety net. You can tell it's moving beyond just the government role, and that there's now a much more shared responsibility for this information to go from the government into business as well. The next area that I would say, oh, I've got a joiner. The next area that I would say is also, material resource scarcity. So again, we found through some of the supply chain disruption at the beginning of the pandemic, businesses became much more aware of the vulnerability of their supply chains and the impact on communities. So in this next piece, I'd like to talk a little bit about, now I know we've gone into the ESG, but what I wanted to show is over on the left-hand side here on the economic. So the reason why I put economic alongside the ES and G categories is because we have here, I would say in the red box, what our traditional view of economic impacts are from an investment analysis perspective. So you're looking at the financial performance, financial reporting, and perhaps tax practices. But if we expand our view across all of these other categories, you can start to, I think, understand the magnitude of the challenge that is in front of business right now in terms of having strategies, control, and performance indicators that help to demonstrate how they're managing across this full set of potential risks and opportunities. So if we think as well about the internal controls and over, for example, over financial reporting, are those being applied across all of these other topics? And again, I think it's emerging practice in nature to start thinking that way and start to expand the operating controls around at a similar level that are for financial reporting across to all of these other E, S, and G categories. So further to the why that we talked about, I just wanted to share this because I think it's just a really helpful visual. The reason why investors are doing this isn't because it's the right thing to do. I mean, sure, that might be part of it, but there is research and evidence, empirical evidence that actually demonstrates that responsible companies and companies who are really working to improve performance on E, S, and G factors outperform traditional companies who are not perhaps focused on that. So you can see here we've got two different graphs. One is the MSCI World Socially Responsible Investing Index, and another is against the MSCI World since inception until 2018. And so on the left-hand side here, you see that the socially responsible investing category. So this is an index which provides capitalization weighted to exposure to companies with really high environmental, social, and governance ratings. So they are, again, are the leaders in ESG performance. You can see here in for the World Index that there is a nuanced outperformance of the responsible company performance. On the right-hand side, this is for emerging markets. So the distinction is accentuated even more, up to about a 40% difference between the performance of net returns in US dollars between the emerging markets, sustainable ESG leaders, and just the standard MSCI Emerging Markets Index. So again, the rationale here really for investors in terms of why they're doing this is because there is now evidence that that companies that do care to ESG factors will have improved financial returns. Now, we've touched on this a little bit as well in terms of the patchwork of reporting standards, and Janet, I think you've introduced that well for us. So again, there's a balance here of a number of different organizations which are working. Some of them are starting to work together, and because there's again an acknowledged challenge that this presents for business in terms of selecting and aligning with certain standards, frameworks, and initiatives. And it becomes very complex to manage the multiple requirements of each. So there's been, recent efforts to endorse, for example, as we see here on the right-hand side, the Canada's 8 largest pension funds have called for more extensive and standardized ESG disclosures, and have really focused in on the promotion of SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, as the best frameworks. So again, I think there's an expectation that we're going to see more and more businesses aligning with those topics. Just in terms of the state of reporting, this is from a KPMG publication from late into 2020. It helps to sort of highlight where Canadian practice stands at this point in time in terms of both reporting. So you see 92% of Canadian companies, now this is for the N100 largest Canadian companies, are producing sustainability reports. While only 43% of those have third-party assurance, but that number has gone up 135% since 2017, which was when we last did this research. So again, given the increased focus on the data and the reporting, as this is becoming such meaningful information to investment analysis, the rigor with which this information is being produced is really increasing. So when I talked earlier about financial controls over, controls over financial reporting, and that now being applied to sustainability reporting, this is really where we see that come to fruition, because they're really looking at tools like audit and assurance to help enhance the robustness of that data. So what are the types of things that matter to investors? So we can see here we have focus areas which include things like compliance, permitting, licensing, the appropriateness of policies and controls, reputational risk, and adverse media. The types of things that I would say are considered flags, which again, in my experience in working with investors, the idea here is not always in the initial diligence to make a full evaluation of the value creation expectations or opportunities. It really initially is about identifying kind of the state of play for an organization in terms of ESG, to understand what work and opportunities exist. So that might include things like fatalities, incidents of non-compliance, fines and liabilities. There could be a much more meaningful investment required in a company that has these types of flags within their historic performance. And so in thinking about discounted cash flow and things like that investors are trying to incorporate into their models, they're really, again, thinking about what potential impacts could these types of flags have on the performance of returns of that investment. I won't go further into this, but again, we'll be sharing these slides after, but it again just helps to highlight on an ESG basis some of the types of flags which I have encountered in the past, which would certainly be something of priority and concern to investment committees. But again, this will be shared in the materials that are distributed. So how do we see financial institutions managing ESG? Well, this is one particular area I've highlighted here in red. Depending on the FI, they are utilizing a number of different strategies, which can range from not considering ESG at all on the left, exclusion strategies where they are avoiding certain potentially damaging or certain industries which they want to avoid based on generally ethical or moral criteria. We have in the middle the ESG integration category, which is much more, again, focused on working alongside companies to improve an ESG performance factor over time. We have inclusion, which is the positive screening of certain ESG factors. We have as well active shareholder activities. So again, participating via proxy voting and other means to enforce ESG performance. And then finally, we have impact investing, which is again a very specific and targeted strategy, which looks at generating social and environmental impact alongside financial impact. The investment life cycle here is, as you can see, typically where we're seeing activity from investors, I would say is very heavily focused on 2 phases right now, 2 to 3 of these. So due diligence, certainly, and acquisition. So we're seeing, again, ESG factors are included in scoping and in screening activities, and certainly in due diligence. Which is a lot of the work that my team are doing these days, is really helping to facilitate the implementation of due diligence on ESG factors. And that is working alongside, as you see across here at the bottom, the traditional advisor suite. So what we're doing is helping to embed and draw out the ESG factors within the traditional advisor capabilities. So within FDD, with technical EHS, with background checks, and through legal and compliance. In transition and in terms of 100-day planning, again, we're seeing a lot of the findings from diligence feed into planning to help improve and leverage opportunities for the investment. Ownership, again, we're seeing a lot on active engagement through targeted ESG opportunities, which investors have chosen to focus on. And then at exit, we're also seeing quite a bit of focus here in terms of helping to communicate the investments that have been put into an organization through an investor's hold period. So I know we've already talked about net zero and some of the other issues around climate change, but I thought this one, and I'll just probably wrap up on this, would be a really great illustration. We see a lot of organizations committing to be net zero, and I just wanted to give an illustrated timeline over which the consideration for emissions and emissions reductions, what that actually looks like, because it goes far beyond a statement or a claim of we're going to be net zero by 2050. It takes a lot of thoughtful and rigorous analysis to understand, particularly for the investors to understand how they're going to reach net zero, or for banks and financial institutions, because it's a very complex exercise to both understand what your starting point is, but also in terms of how you're going to reach your objectives and targeted reductions. But even for a business who is trying to wrap their own arms around what their emissions are and how they are going to contribute to a lower carbon future, it takes quite a bit of time. And so again, the advice here really is to allow yourself a multi-year period that will need to be updated, as additional information comes to the forefront. So with that, I'm going to pause here. There's more content in here, which you can see when the slides are distributed, but I'd love to pass it over to Helle and hear more about governance.
Start by unmuting myself and then see if I can share my screen. Thank you so much, Kitty. And I now know, your superpower. You have your own little helper. So I should say to everyone, Katie actually gone through the ESG Competent Board Certificate program, and I was so impressed with her at that as well. And now I know it's the little helper. So thank you all for, all of you for really, really great insight. And things are moving extremely fast. And I think from my end, how do we ensure that we have the tone at the top? So Katie, you just said, well, we can all go out and say, yeah, we're going to be carbon, zero by 2050. How many of us would be in the positions we are in now by 2050? So we need to have those transition plans, and we need to have the tone at the top. We need to have the board of directors to make informed decisions. So in M&A efforts, I would always ask in terms of the board of directors, what is the strategy in that regard? What is the transition? How much is the board on board? So Ian, thank you for the introduction. And you said I probably would say a little bit about competent board. So I do that very briefly, but try to get it into what we are talking about. So the ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program is a global program. We have, as I said here, over 100 renowned global leaders. You see some of them on the screen that are contributing with their insight, with their experience, and have discussions with other board of directors or senior business professionals about how do you really understand and drive the agenda also from the boardroom. And again, if we're looking at it from a value creation point of view, I have unfortunately seen so many companies that have had great sustainability projects, social projects, environmental projects, but leaving so much money on the table because it was not embedded into the governance. It was pet project, sometimes where you had not necessarily really have it as a part of the business strategy and the value creation. So you see some of the global leaders here, and feel free to reach out for more information on that. I want to start with person that some of you might now see is in the Dragon's Den, the good West Hall, who is one of those that are contributing to the program and discussing with the participants. And I think what he says, I never met the company that says when they're involved in an activist situation or receive a shareholder proposal, I knew it was going to come, because if it was going to come, they should have done something about it. I would say it's hard at this moment to say, oh, I have never heard about carbon. I have never heard about stranded assets. I've never heard about all of these things. And that's what we're seeing in Australia, where we now have the Minister for Climate that have to figure out, is her duty, it's the court in Australia said, when she is going to give approval or not approval to a company. We have it in the Shell case out of the Netherlands, where it was more in terms of the community that starts saying, well, you have a duty, not only, which is very interesting, they're not only saying going backwards, but actually going forwards. And of course, I think we all have seen in terms of Exxon Mobil, in terms of the board of directors, was actually voted out from a small hedge fund that started but got the support of all of the other BlackRocks of the world, and now have got 3 seats on the board. So this is moving extremely, extremely fast at the moment. So in terms of reflection into board policies and mandates, another person that part of the program is Katie Taylor, and this is actually from last year. And I should say last year we did this same session, but the day after today. So it is almost exactly a year ago. But that does not mean that this is not true. It's actually even more true today. I think that many activist investors are very interested in ESG issues. And it goes further than that. We just see the G7, so Canada included, but all the G7 countries, where the finance ministers is going in and saying, we are endorsing, I think we can say, committing to reporting on climate, but also on nature-related financial disclosure. So if you haven't looked into it, so much more to come on that. And from the voluntary reporting, I'm quite sure we're going to see mandatory reporting coming up fairly soon. We also have what's called the COP26 happening this year. It's one of these big meetings where everyone around the world meet in terms of climate. Last one you might have heard about, the Paris Agreement back some years. This is the next one. And I think we will see a lot of commitments and accountability coming out of that. I put these 10 steps towards good ESG governance together. And I think it's important when, both from a company point of view, but also from an M&A point of view, to ask some of these questions. As the board of directors, do they have the necessary insight into all of these ESG matters, climate, all of the matters that we've been talking about here? Do they understand the stakeholders? Do they understand the concerns? Not as only what it is today, but can they see around corners and see what are the concerns that might be coming up? And there's a lot of signals out there. So again, it's not that is like, oh, I haven't ever thought about this and this. Water scarcity, we have in, I believe, Oregon, I just saw, in terms of people starting fighting over water. We have droughts, etc. It's not something that we go like, I've never heard about this. So you want to make sure that the company is actually aware, and more than aware, what's the plan? Are they part of the solution, or are they part of the problem? Have they determined what are the material ESG risks and opportunities, and really embedded that into the strategy? Again, we just talked about the ESG measures. I'm not going to go in and saying E is this, and well, environment, social, and governance. And then where I think we need to see more is the attention from the board of directors. It's not enough to get the report after the fact and read it and say, oh, nice pictures. You need to ensure that the board of directors have signed off ahead of actually the report is being finalized, that they agree what are the material issues, who are the material stakeholders, what is it really that we need to communicate to our shareholders as well as to our stakeholders. And are they willing to sign off? I think Katie's colleagues from KPMG, you're the big four, well, all assurance providers will need to start really ensuring that they can also audit all of these measures that are, we might call them non-financial. They are financial, and they are cutting more and more into the financial. I think, Katie, you were talking about the SASB, and I saw IRC, which is the International Integrated Reporting Council. They actually just merged with SASB. So if you go out and look now for the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board standard, you would actually see that that is now the Value Reporting Foundation. So, and a lot in terms of the financial world is working together on getting standards that are embedded into the financial reporting, so IFRS and other things that I will not bore you with. The other thing is, of course, do we have the accountability measures in place? Is the board, is this something that sits at the audit committee, and where does it sit in the company? Is it not only that we have this into the C-suite, but where in the organization, where in the value chain have we really integrated the decision making? How do we understand what is happening different places in the value chain? If we talk about Modern Slavery Act, well, that might be, as you were saying, out in your supply chain, but be aware, it might be those that come and clean your office. It might be those you go to and clean your shirt. We actually have the person that are been influencing all of these governments that are speaking at the program. And it's heartbreaking to hear how close it is. It might be, you know, your neighbor's daughter, or so let's open our eyes for what are these different things. Align with incentives. It is so easy to say, oh, we don't want to buy something in a foreign country with child labor or forced labor on environmental impact. But if your procurement team have incentives, that is, get this as cheap as possible, I don't care how, well, you will have the problem when it gets to the border. And you'll see a lot of you know, top gloves out of Malaysia that was stopped at the US border, but you'll see a lot more that is stopped at the moment at the border because of these matters. So it's not enough anymore to say, okay, you know, you just go do your job. You need to align with the incentives. Reporting, we talked a lot about reporting. So I think reporting is important, not just to have the nice pictures, but as I just go back and say, ensure that the board of directors actually are on board also with the reporting and have signed off on it. That the company's response to ESG demands is aligned to the materiality and professionality of the issue to the business is also very important. And on that comes also your lobbying activities. And sometimes we're seeing that on one hand, companies go out and say what some would call the right things, but at the same time you have lobbying, or you might even just be part of an organization that are saying the opposite. And that is being called out at the moment. So again, how do we align all of these things and into that? And then of course, ensure that the ongoing, open your door, open your kitchen door, invite people in and really hear what are their views and points on many of these, and understand that this is moving very, very fast. Keep an eye on the G7 meeting this week. Keep an eye on what's going to happen in terms of G20, but also the COP meetings, etc. This gentleman is actually now an advisor to Mark Carney, and as he said to me the other day, in terms of these board of directors that's been voted out, well, if they had the education, and I was of course happy that he said if they had gone through the ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program, they would probably not have found themselves in that place. So I think it's also from a self-interest point of view for the board of directors to ensure that they have this insight, they can see around corners, and they can not only ask the questions, but they can actually also understand the answers they are getting. I'm a little bit afraid at the moment that we have, on one hand, we have, you know, the people from the company sitting and having their cheat sheet, and then you have on the other hand asset managers or whoever else also with their cheat sheet. But if no one really understands what is the answers that is being presented, well, we're not going to move any further on this, and a lot of money will be lost. I'm just going to look at the clock here, but I think we probably over time. So these are the 12 questions to ask, but also the 12 different issues that we are actually looking at in the ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program. So it's everything for tax, and you might have seen that we're also talking now about a global tax, minimum tax. It's anti-corruption. It's what we said about Modern Slavery Act and human rights issues, etc., etc. So many of these things, and again, of course, happy to discuss. One last thing I will leave you with is that we put out a report about the future boardroom competences, and when you get the slides, you'll see a little bit more on some of the findings there. But we simply put out, asked global leaders, what does stewardship in the 21st century look like, but also what are the competences and personal traits that you expect from board of directors. And based on that, we put this into a report and almost have a little self-assessment that you can do, or you can assess when you're going out and doing due diligences. And of course, if anything is missing, please let us know. And then I would say that we are looking for top 100 ESG competent board members and top 100 ESG competent boards. So if you have anyone in mind, send them our way, and so we can start to have that going up there. So I think with that, I will, there's some of these slides that you are going to get where you see all of the competences here, but I think that is from my end. See if I can stop sharing my screen, unless I should.
Thank you very much, Helle. Ian, will we turn it over to you? I'm not sure if there are any questions that have come in. How do we feel about the time?
I think we're, you guys are, that's a huge amount of content and lots of really important stuff. I don't have any, I haven't seen any questions come through. I know, and we're kind of at the hour. So I guess the question it's been sort of racking my brain here is, how do you prioritize some of this stuff? Because there's so much content in there and it crosses over so many important areas. But if you're and I mean, I'll push it back to you, Helle, because you were the one just finished speaking. Maybe you can start in answering this one. So I'm working on an M&A deal, and there's an ESG issue, and what's how do I prioritize some of these issues, and how do I sort of cut through this? And I the examples that were put forward about the Western Australian mine's a good example, but it's dramatic. But there's obviously some smaller issues that come up from on a day-to-day basis. What advice are you giving to people in these situations?
I'm sure, Katie, you also want to comment on this one, but I think, look at the issue and see who are impacted. Who are the stakeholders that are already impacted or could be impacted by this? How material is it, right? And basically, you can use the simple test. Would I be happy that this is in front of Globe and Mail tomorrow, right? I mean, it's a very, very simple thing to do, but it will start asking you, oh, okay, would I be happy to say that I've blown up, in terms of Australia, something that can never be again? If I put myself in the shoes of the Indigenous people in Australia, would I be happy with this? Well, probably not. What are the consequences of doing it? Is this really worth it, right? I mean, some very basic values that are now connecting so much with the value of your deal afterwards.
Yep. Thank you. I'm mindful of Mark Carney's book out about, the conflating of value to our values here, and it'll be a challenge for the next generation to figure out how we incorporate our broader values into these various business activities that we're engaged in. So it should be fun.
Well, and I think you're probably going to, for some, almost be forced to it when we start talking about water scarcity, when we start talking about many of it's going to impact you in a way where it's suddenly externalities is going to be embedded into the prices, right? So you're going to internalize all the externalities that we have been used to saying, oh, someone else is paying for it in the future. So yeah.
No, you're right. Tragedy of the commons, right? So
Exactly.
Yeah. That's great. Melanie, any questions from you?
No, I think that's great. That was an awesome and fulsome presentation. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, look, on behalf of the M&A Club, thank you, Janet. Thank you, Helle. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Sophie. I really appreciate all your efforts, and we look forward to seeing you in person when we can do that. Which I think we're all optimistic that that's going to happen relatively soon. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, and we look forward to connecting again soon. And keep focused on new M&A Club events coming up. We've got lots of stuff planned. I won't go over it on this call because we're kind of over time, but thank you, Lorene, for organizing all this stuff, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.